So I've done my project on Rudolf Dreikurs and his democratic teaching and management skills. So Rudolf Dreikurs was born in Vienna, Austria in 1897 and graduated from medical school at the University of Vienna. He was particularly interested in social psychology, more specifically the psychology of the individual, and he felt the connection to the work of Alfred Adler, who was a psychologist who came before him. Um, Dreikurs studied children, families, sibling relationships, marriage, and prisons, and he was fascinated by why people misbehave, and he was particularly interested in nonviolent ways to produce good behavior. Alfred Adler was born in Vienna, Austria in 1870, and he started his career in ophthalmology, but then switched over to psychology, specifically the psychology of the individual. Most of Adler's work was briefly associated with Freud, but Adler did not agree with some of Freud's views on the subconscious heavy analysis of human motivations. Adler believed that humans are primarily motivated by their universal need for community and social acceptance. And Adler founded the Adlerian psychotherapy, which is a field of therapy that focuses on helping patients to reach their desired goals through the removal of negative beliefs, attitudes, or choices. So the democratic classroom. Here's a quote from Rudolf Dreikurs' novel, Maintaining Sanity in the Classroom, and it says, "To live as equals with our fellow humans, we must cooperate with them. Cooperation and democracy must be based on consideration of others' rights and interests while standing up for one's own rights. This is the formula for equality. Mutual respect is its premise." And this is basically the whole premise of Dreikurs' work with the democratic classroom. It stresses the importance of equality and mutual respect within the classroom, which we'll get into a bit, but he believed that a democratic space where everyone is equal doesn't necessarily mean disorder. And in fact, the cooperation within the class can help to take away some of this disorder that could come. So some of the characteristics of a democratic classroom: the student and teacher are united in the planning, implementation, and organization of common endeavors. The teacher provides a base as an accessible expert rather than an unapproachable autocrat. So instead of a more traditional version of the autocratic classroom, which is typically the way it is, meaning that the teacher has complete control and total control over the classroom. Dreikurs pushed more for a democratic classroom where the students had, more say in the way that teachers plan the class. So Another characteristic of the democratic classroom is the combination of firmness, which is one's self-respect, and kindness, which is respect for others. And of course, that will be followed by both the teacher and the students. Teacher and students maintain an atmosphere where all are equally valued and respected. Freedom of decision-making, trustworthiness, and communal responsibility are all emphasized in activities. Logical consequences rather than punishment, and then also encouragement rather than praise. So basically Dreikurs was a huge fan of this democratic classroom. He said that the classroom doesn't necessarily have to be a space where teachers just teach and students just learn, but rather that it should be more of a collaborative effort in that, wherein the teacher can learn from the students, along with the students learning from the teacher. Dreikurs believed that there's a lot more going on in the social environment of the classroom than just teaching and learning, and so he uses these within the democratic classroom model as a way of explaining and dealing with the things that actually happen within a real life classroom. Logical consequence versus punishment. Logical consequences refer more to addressing a misbehavior in a way that teaches the student the correct way to, act within a situation. So if a behavior is one student hitting another, a punishment would be an in-school suspension, which is more so just like, you did something bad, so here is your way of, seeking penance. Whereas the logical consequence for this situation would be having a conversation about what the student failed to communicate by hitting, and then allowing the student who was hit to express their feelings. So both having that conversation with the student who was the aggressor in the situation, the student that hit the other, and communicating with them, especially or specifically what they did wrong and why it was wrong, rather than just giving them an in-school suspension and saying, okay, that's it. So similarly to that, another example would be if a student broke a piece of classroom equipment. A punishment for that would be considered something like detention, or giving the student detention, rather than with the logical consequence, you would have the student repair the equipment if that was possible, or taking away the student's privilege with the equipment because they broke it, instead of just giving them detention. So it's teaching students to see what their actions were and giving them consequences in response to that action, so that they can help to learn how to correct misbehavior within the future. Similarly to that, Dreikurs focus on the aspect of encouragement versus praise. So rather than praising students for what they did in that moment, focusing more on encouraging them to continue these actions so that their good behaviors can continue within the future. So, for example, the behavior in the situation would be that a student did well on the quiz. Instead of praising them by telling the student, oh, you're so smart, you should encourage the student by saying, well, you were very committed to studying, and so your hard work paid off. Or another example, helping a student helped a fellow classmate with an assignment. And so an example of praise in this moment would be, you get extra time for recess because you were a good tutor for your friend. Instead, you should encourage the student by saying, thank you so much for volunteering your time to help your classmate. So rather than giving the student that vocal praise or verbal praise or some sort of tangible reward, you're giving them this greater sense of self in their endeavors within the classroom. So misbehavior, Dreikurs, though he did have his own very specific ways of looking at the classroom and looking at individuals in the classroom, he did take a few things from Adler and his in-depth study of individual psychology. These findings shaped his work, particularly his views about the motivations of humans and their actions. Dreikurs also believed that humans were extremely logical and calculating beings, and so this is what drives us through our day-to-day functions. This is another quote from Dreikurs' books, Maintaining Sanity in the Classroom. It says, the basic cause of conflict in the classroom is social inequality among individuals and groups. If the social relationship among people is unstable, it inevitably leads to conflict and disharmony. So Dreikurs really stressed the importance of equality and mutual respect within the classroom. To him, a democratic space where everyone is equal doesn't necessarily mean disorder. He believed that for democracy to thrive within the classroom, freedom and order have to exist in tandem, both of them doing their place to monitor, but also like progress students' actions within the class. So some of the reasons that Dreikurs gave for misbehavior were that every child is different, so they all have their specific reasons and methods when they are put into social situations. Well-adjusted children find social acceptance by contributing to the welfare of the group/family/classroom. And then children who misbehave are not able to do that. All misbehavior comes from mistaken concept, which is basically the idea that the child thought it was correct, but is not actually correct in the view of society. And so the child also, from this, produces a mistaken approach because they think that they have the correct idea of the concept, and so with that incorrect idea, they are approaching the situation completely wrong. And so that often leads to this idea of misbehavior. And then also all humans, children included, want to fit in socially. All behaviors are the means to an end, and then no behavior is without purpose. And children will repeat behaviors that get them closer to social acceptance and attention. And that's not necessarily if the behavior is a bad behavior or a good behavior, So students will continue to, or really young minds will continue to repeat these behaviors if they think that, or if they see that their peers are accepting them more because of the misbehavior. So some of the useful and useless things referring to behavior, some of the useful ideas, it turned toward the cooperative action for the common good of the classroom and the group, the tendency to encourage self and others, and the child interacts with others with others out of genuine concern for their well-being. The students bring about happiness, or the democratic classroom brings about happiness and fulfillment for others as well as self through useful contributions. Some of the useless ideas that pop up within the democratic classroom are the idea that it's turned towards self-promotion, the tendency to criticize self and others, students are concerned primarily with the achievement and praise for themselves. The child does not believe that they have access to social acceptance, and the child may believe that they can only obtain acceptance by mistaken goals of behavior. So mistaken goals of behavior is that it refers to the attention, power, inadequacy, revenge, and basically Dreikurs believed that the same behavior can be employed to achieve more than one mistaken goal. For example, some of the behaviors that refer to attention are showing off, laziness, bossiness, crying, trying to be charming, the eagerness to please, oversensitivity, these thought-provoking ideas of I only fit in when people are paying attention to me. So instead, some of the reactions that should come from the teacher should be more of they should stray away from this idea of coaxing or, giving extra reminders or being annoyed or pitying students. Some of the goals that, the mistaken goals of behavior that are consistent with the analysis of power, are being stubborn. And so the teacher will feel threatened in their position of leadership, the student being disobedient. They're concerned with what other children will think, students refusing to do work or arguing with the teacher, getting angry, having to win, needing to be the boss. And so instead, the teacher should stay away from diverting their energy to controlling or battling with the student, but instead using the ideas of logical consequences to allow students to continue learning in the best possible nature. So some of the mistaken goals of behavior and inadequacy, some of the behaviors may include feeling less smart than other kids or giving in quickly, or not trying to engage in activities, being happiest when alone or when no demands are being made, or really any show of perfectionism. And the teacher's reaction to these may be exhausting a number of resources, trying to reach this child, or getting discouraged and giving up. For revenge, there are the attitudes or behaviors of theft, violence, viciousness, destruction of property, accusing others of unfairness, believing that no one likes them, or even wanting to get perceived for slights. And so oftentimes teachers, the reactions are feeling hurt or disliking students or feeling the need to protect other children, asking the children to avoid the or asking children to avoid the violent or aggressive child. So from this research, some of my own observations and conclusions. My biggest concern or question here was, does this work for Black students? Does the psychology of individuality really apply to marginalized identities? And because these folks tend to not have that same luxury of being considered individuals, specifically within communities of people of color, where poverty and lack of good school systems and good schools in general are a major issue. Another question I had about this was, what about disabled students or students who have exceptionalities? Does the democratic classroom affect these students differently than a child who is a typical child? This model relies a lot on the social pressure or social expectations. And so what if the students have different social expectations? Will they still feel the same need to fit in with the group, or will they still feel the need to participate and engage within this democratic classroom? So within this, where do all of Freud's models of the subconscious motivation fit in, and how much have they strayed? Also, just in thinking, are kids really this conscious? And how does this apply to teaching things such as dance to children, or specifically tap dance like here? Um, and then how does this work in learning environments where the teacher is not present with the students all day for an extended period of time? In teaching dance, you might just see students once a week or a couple of times a week. And so does this allow the teacher, or me in a specific situation, to build that same sort of relationship and trust and cooperation within the democratic classroom model? These are just a few of Dreikurs' books. Actually, the last two here, The New Approach to Discipline, Logical Consequences, and Maintaining Sanity in the Classroom, are both, they're two of the sources that I used for this presentation. They both discuss the new approach to discipline. Logical Consequences talks about logical consequences more in depth, and then Maintaining Sanity in the Classroom talks more about just general the model of the democratic classroom, and also how to use that in a manner that assists with the education portion of your class. And then here are my references. Overall, I found this presentation to be really interesting, especially in the use of the cooperation within the classroom. I think that using students, not just as students, but having their input into the class, allows for a more loving and nurturing classroom environment, but also it can contribute to students' actual understanding within the material. And so I found this to be really interesting and something that I should look into within my own classroom. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation on Rudolf Dreikurs and his model of the democratic classroom. Yes. My name is Jessica Eugene, and this has been my presentation on Rudolf Dreikurs and the democratic classroom model.